So as Murtaza explained, this is our effort to come up with a comprehensive policy framework for the gaming industry of Sri Lanka. We are not in any way stipulating specific recommendations, but we are kind of putting out a framework as to how to think about approaching this industry from an economist point of view when you think about how to regulate the industry. So to define gaming first, gaming is generally defined as any industry involving any game of chance. If there is an element of luck involved in any game that humans play for entertainment or for some kind of revenue generation, then that would fall under gaming. So the gaming industry of Sri Lanka presently consists of the casino industry, the betting centers, and the lotteries industry. People also engage in casual bets, and also the concept of cheat tools is quite popular, especially among rural women. But these are in no way organized industries, so it doesn't necessarily come under the gaming industry. But interestingly, when Sri Lanka first had some kind of regulation on gaming, that was the Cheetu Ordinance in the 1840s by the British colonial government. So when you talk about the casino industry of Sri Lanka, the historical evolution of it, the British basically outlawed the industry in 1889. This was basically modeled after the Gaming Act in the UK at the time. It was basically implemented word for word here in Sri Lanka, and what it said was that all common gaming houses are to be outlawed. What that meant was that all of the gaming houses we had in Sri Lanka that basically facilitated any form of game of chance had to be outlawed, and we only had casinos coming again in the post 1977 era when the economy was liberalized. You could import jackpot machines and all of the equipment you need to run these casinos, and you had basically maybe a dozen of small scale casino operations in Peta mostly, that were basically uh, in the form of London gaming style clubs. These were not full fledged casinos by any stretch of the imagination. These were mostly Rugino houses, which is basically uh, the technicalities of the difference between Ruginos and casinos is not that clear. But basically, there are games that are legally um, recognized as casino games by the gaming ordinance, and whatever doesn't fall under that is generally considered a Rugino game. And you had a lot of Rugino games and some casino games in the 1977, post 1977 period, basically. But the industry went mainstream only in the 1980s when Josim came to Sri Lanka. He was a casino operator of Singaporean origin, and he came and established three casinos in one at Galadari, one at Gold Face, um, and one at, I believe it was at the Intercontinental Hotel, and that was what brought casinos to the mainstream of Sri Lanka. But what happened was in 1991, Josim had a falling out with the then president of Sri Lanka. No one really knows what the reason was, but basically overnight all of these casinos were raided and Josim was deported out of the country. Um, the justification for the raiding was that they were violating the promiscuous gambling provision in the gaming ordinance that said you can't have common gaming houses, right? So in 1993, casinos came back, but instead of them being common gaming houses, they were basically marketed as members only establishments. So you have to obtain a membership to be able to go and gamble. But the catch here was that you could basically obtain walk-in membership. You just walk into the entrance and they give you membership instantly, and then you go and gamble, right? So that loophole was used by all of these operators that established casinos back then. And now today the industry consists of four players who are Bailey's, Bellagio, Casino Marina, and Stardust. So I don't think a lot of you probably have not visited a casino in Sri Lanka. So I wanted to kind of give you an understanding of how things happen in these Sri Lankan casinos. which is quite different to the casinos you find outside of Sri Lanka, right? If you go to Genting, if you go to Sentosa, if you go to Vegas, you see all of these very big operations with hotels, restaurants, and entertainment shows and all of that. But in Sri Lanka, of course, you don't have that kind of integrated resort, right? What you have is standalone casinos, and they are very mid-sized in scale at best. So all of these casinos, except Stardust, primarily caters to foreign patrons, and they're primarily Indians. They say around 85% of the patrons in these casinos are of Indian origin, and they are basically flown in by the marketing and the sales teams of these casinos. You also have a significant number of Chinese patrons, but these are not people that are flown in from China because Sri Lanka has a Chinese resident community. Those are the people who just walk into casinos because culturally the Chinese and the Indians are known to be high propensity gamblers. When it comes to these Indians who are flown in, they usually purchase packages that can range from INR 500,000 to INR I think I meant to say INR 100 million. Usually the transactions happen overseas. And once those transactions happen, what ends up happening is the transactions happen in Indian currency in India. So we don't really know how much of the money comes to Sri Lanka, right? Usually these packages fully cover the flight tickets, bed and breakfast accommodation, and also is customizable. For instance, if a patron wants to go and travel around Sri Lanka, then they usually make those arrangements for them as well. The lunch and dinner buffets um, at the casinos, obviously, are places where you can have unlimited food and beverages, and also usually alcohol and tobacco is basically free and on the house. And you can play a select set of games. They don't have all of the games that you can find in a lot of these big casinos in countries around the world, but you can usually expect to be able to engage in poker, three-card poker, Texas Hold'em poker, baccarat roulette, blackjack, jackpot, and under bahar. So these seem to be the games that they offer. Uh, the other thing that's unique to Sri Lankan casinos compared to other countries is a lot of the people that come in, because they usually fly into Sri Lanka, right? Not everyone would be up to it unless they were serial gamblers, compulsive gamblers. So these are very experienced compulsive gamblers that fly in. So they have very little interest in slot machines. Slot machines are, those computer game like machines that you find in a lot of casinos in other countries, that inexperienced gamblers go and basically load up a card with like a $5-10 uh basically prepaid thing, and then you just like swipe it in and you just like play on the slot machine, right? So you don't see a lot of that happening in Sri Lankan casinos, because these are very experienced gamblers who actually want to come and play poker or serious table games. The other interesting thing about the industry in Sri Lanka is that it almost entirely runs on cash. You can't use a credit card to buy chips, so you have to basically withdraw money from the ATM that's located within the premises, or bring your cash from outside and then buy your chips at the table. And you are not issued a receipt when you buy these chips generally. So these are a list of the games and their odds of payout. So there are different forms of roulette. You have American roulette, British roulette, European roulette, but the odds of payouts is 35 to 1, for instance. And the house edge is basically the average profit that is expected, the gross profit that is expected by the casino from each game, right? So you have these games that are very popular in Sri Lankan casinos that I've listed, and there are different odds of payout. So the interesting thing about slot machines is that the payouts actually vary by game, because it's a lot of, think of it as, a bunch of computer games in the machine that people play, and because of that, the house edge also varies, but it's usually a lot higher than table games. So in a lot of the casinos in other countries, slot machines are where they make their money, because you can actually earn higher returns. But in Sri Lanka, they actually make most of their money through these table games, because that's what the patrons here are interested in. Moving on to the betting industry of Sri Lanka. The betting industry first came to existence in the 1820s, when races were held at the Golf Face promenade. Back then it was known as the Kolpiti Race Course. The brother of Governor uh, sorry, but the brother of English explorer Samuel Baker was the one who actually wanted to have races held in Colombo, and that is what actually started this industry here. And then the Nuwara race course was opened in the 1840s, and at some point in 1890s, the Kolpiti race course was moved to Reed Avenue, which is the race course that you have now. And both of these were basically managed by the Colombo Turf Club. The industry came to a sudden halt with the ban on the importation of thoroughbred horses in 1956 by the then newly elected SLFP government. And that basically put the industry on pause for a long time until the bookmaking establishments that you see today, Sporting Times and Sporting Star, they came into existence where they basically telecast horse races or dog races or other sporting events that happen outside of Sri Lanka, and you can basically bet on what you basically watch on the screen. So it's a bunch of screens, and you can see all of these races happen, and you walk in, and you bet on the horses or the dogs or whatever, right? The way it works in these betting houses is basically assume there are 5 horses in a race. You go and pick the horse of your choice. Say you bet 100 rupees on that horse, and assume that for the people bet on the rest of the 4 horses on the game, right? So basically, you have 500 rupees in total being bet. The bookmaker will keep a commission out of that, which is usually 10%. So the bookmaker will get 50, and whoever wins the bet, whichever wins, whichever horse wins will end up getting the rest of the 450 of that amount. So that is how it works. And when it comes to the lottery industry of Sri Lanka, I'm happy to see that there are some representatives from the lotteries boards here today with us. The lotteries industry came into existence as a result of the lotteries ordinance of 1844. But back then, what you mostly had were private lotteries that were basically conducted at events, right? The first state lottery came into being in 1955, which was basically introduced by the Minister of Health back then, Minister Nugabella, and it was called the Hospital Lottery. It was based on the success of that the National Lotteries Board was established in 1969, and the mandate of the National Lotteries Board is to basically contribute to the consolidated fund of the Treasury. And you also had the Development Lotteries Board established in 1983, and the mandate of the Development Lotteries Board is to contribute to the President's Fund and the Mahapala Scholarship Fund. Interestingly, the Mahapala Fund is also an authorized operator of lotteries in Sri Lanka, but unfortunately, despite many attempts in the past, they have not been able to successfully launch a lottery yet. Uh, uh, National Lotteries Board, being the first and also the national operator of lotteries, technically is the regulatory body for the lotteries industry of Sri Lanka. But the Development Lotteries Board and the Mahapala Fund have been made exempt by the Mahapala Act and the DLB Act from regulation by the National Lotteries Board. So there's not really much of regulatory work that's done by the National Lotteries Board, except when you have raffles and stuff happening, you need the authorization, and there are laws that say you can't basically print tickets that resemble lottery tickets that are run by the NLB and the DLB and stuff like that. But generally, the regulatory function is not necessarily carried out because there's nothing to regulate unless they regulate themselves, which is a conflict of interest, right? When you look at the legal framework governing the gaming industry of Sri Lanka, there's the NLB and the DLB acts that basically govern the lotteries. The betting centers have the betting ordinance that covers it, but the casinos specifically are an interesting case because the legal framework has long been questioned and has led to many concerns, partly because of the many confusing elements surrounding it. So the gaming ordinance of 1889, like I said before, basically banned the operation of commonplace gaming houses, but somewhere towards the 1990s they realized that they could use the members only loophole to have casinos here, right? And also the Betting and Gaming Levy Act number 40 of 1988, which has been amended many times since, has put in place what's called an annual levy on all of these casinos that are in operation. But none of these things necessarily ascribed any actual legal status to these casinos because they were being run on a loophole, essentially. So in 2010, when the Casino Business Regulation Act was passed in the Parliament of Sri Lanka, that was the first time, that was the first attempt rather to basically give some kind of legitimate legal status to the casinos. But interestingly, although it said that all casinos should operate with a license, it did not actually lay out a framework to obtain a license. So now you have, back then I believe we had 5 casinos in Sri Lanka because MGM was also in operation at the time. We had 5 casinos back then who were told that they needed licenses to operate, but there was no legal framework laid out as to how you could obtain the licenses, right? So it led to more questions about the legitimacy of these operations. And then you had some investors interested in at the time, the most famous being James Packer with his Crown investment project that didn't materialize in the end, but with their potential entrances to the field, there were more questions being asked about the licensing process, which never got resolved. Um, all of that has kind of been put to rest with the Casino Business Licensing Regulation number 1 of 2022 and the Pursuant Gazette 2369/42 that was issued in February 2024, which basically appointed the Inland Revenue Department, the Commissioner of the Inland Revenue Department, as the person who's authorized to issue licenses to casinos. But still, it doesn't answer the wider questions as to whether the IRD commissioner is actually technically competent. The IRD as an organization is technically competent to issue licenses, or who is going to take on the responsibility of regulation, because that's also something that has been asked quite a few times with no response from the legislative front, right? What I have been told is that there's some kind of draft gazette that has been drawn up about some kind of regulatory authority, but because it has not been made public and no one has necessarily seen the gazette rather properly, we are unable to comment on the contents of that. But nothing has been basically published in the public domain as to what plans the government has in with respect to bringing in a regulator, although the government has, through cabinet decisions and all of that, expressed their interest in tackling this issue several times with no real action to back it up. So what we did before I basically get into our recommendations for the industry, I wanted to basically do a SWOT analysis, a strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats analysis for the industry to figure out where the industry stands right now and what the future for the industry looks like. In terms of the strengths of the industry, it is quite interesting that Sri Lanka is one of the few countries in all of Asia to the right of Southeast Asia that has ascribed legal status to casinos. Nepal also has some casinos, but they're very small scale with not a lot of attraction because it is not necessarily strong on the front of tourism. But beyond that, no other country to the west of Southeast Asia in Asia has or has ascribed legal status to casinos. So Sri Lanka is quite unique in that sense, although there are lingering questions as to how legitimate the operations are. At least there is some sort of legality that has been ascribed through the law, which of course is one of the reasons why a lot of these Indian patrons come to Sri Lanka, because it is one of the countries where you can legally partake in gambling, right? And Sri Lanka is also a key regional player with a substantial consumer pool, because you can imagine when you realize that Sri Lanka is one of the few countries in the region, like all of the Middle Eastern market, the Indian market, right? Mainland China, of course, they can go to Macau, but China is a big country that expands from one end of Asia to the other practically, right? So there are some people who might find it more convenient to fly in here as well. So there's a huge consumer pool that's available to Sri Lanka. But the question is whether all of these people end up coming to Sri Lanka because of the scale of the operations here, as well as the legal and the legitimacy issues that have plagued the industry for a long time. Another strength of the industry, interestingly, is the increasingly open state policy on gambling. So with the passage of the Casino Business Licensing Regulation and also the publishing of the Gazette in 2024, we have basically taken some progressive and open step towards recognizing and endorsing the industry as a legal industry in the country, and that has pointed to a change of heart of the government from previous times as to how they approach the industry. And that, of course, is good news if you are interested in using this industry as a tool for economic growth and revenue generation and so on, which I will talk about later. Uh, but there are lingering weaknesses, of course, that stare us right in the face. For instance, the lack of a stringent regulatory framework. Although this is a topic that has been discussed for a long time, the government has still failed to come up with a basic regulatory mechanism, at least, right, for the industry, and that is an issue. And also, for the longest time, Sri Lanka was not able to attract large investors, and that partly has to do with the opposition of existing players to new players coming in, because they don't want the competition, right? And also because of the regulatory issues in the Sri Lankan context, not a lot of big investors would want to come in, because you have to understand, when it's an industry that has a lot of stigmatization associated with it, you want to basically do everything by the words of the law if you want to, basically maintain your reputation and be perceived in a good light by the public, right? So that's how you get patrons to walk into your casinos. But when you don't have the seal of approval from regulatory body in a country where you're operating, that the industry here is basically run on moral and legal integrity, then of course questions come up as to whether they can actually protect their good name if they come and set up operations here. So that is one of the reasons why good investors have been reluctant to come to the country with their investments. And of course, there are huge challenges to tax administration as well. Although it's a potential source of revenue for the government has not been able to properly audit this industry because of the cash-based nature. I'm not saying or insinuating in any way that there is some kind of tax avoidance or evasion, but what I'm saying is that there's no way to make sure that you can trace all of the inflows out and outflows at these casinos to properly audit what the tax obligations are, and then figure out if these obligations are being met by the operators, right? So the blame doesn't just lie with the players in the game, but also the tax administration is responsibility of the government, and the government has failed to come up with a foolproof mechanism for basically collecting the revenues that it is due from this industry. But lately, you have also begun to see a lot of opportunities for the future growth of the industry. So just a couple of days ago, the Lotus Tower announced that the partnership that was struck between the Majestic Hotel from Goa, that is an operator of offshore casinos in Goa, and basically a Sri Lankan company for a casino at the Lotus Tower. And I'm pretty sure all of you have heard of City of Dreams, Colombo, which is basically an agreement between John Keells and Melco, which is a listed company in Hong Kong that operates casinos in Macau in particular. And what John Keells has told us is that it is a landlord-tenant agreement that they have with Melco, that John Keells is just the landlord and Melco will be operating the casino there, right? And Port City Colombo also in its bill has specifically a provision for a casino, although they're yet to find an investor for the project. But there are these new projects that are coming up that are signaling a different direction for the industry, not just with the entrance of international investors with very good reputations, but also some kind of hope for basically transitioning to the integrated resort model from the standalone mid-sized casinos that we have today to larger scale operations that could benefit the larger tourism industry and the hotel and beverage industry, in addition to the growth of the gaming industry. We have also seen a growth in the tourist arrivals in the recent year, in the past year or so, and that growth has been driven substantially by growth in Indian and Chinese tourists. And given the cultural penchant among Indians and the Chinese to gamble, this again points to an opportunity for us to basically use this opportunity to build up our gaming industry. And also the economic liberalization program that the government has embarked on since the signing of the IMF deal also gives hope that issues that are common to any industry in Sri Lanka, that is in the private sector, with respect to competition and the ease of doing business, that all of these things um, might improve for the better, and that would also basically be good if we are to expand the gaming industry of Sri Lanka. And what also needs to not be forgotten is that there are actually a lot of threats to the future survival of the industry, not just based on the domestic factors here that I talked about, but also there has recently been increasing competition from unlikely neighbors of Sri Lanka. For instance, the United Arab Emirates, who you would not necessarily expect to approve of gambling, has recently announced plans to open up casinos in Abu Dhabi and Ras Al Khaimah, and they will be basically partnering with the Win Group and other well-known international players in the industry to set up these integrated resorts. And what that means is that if Sri Lanka does not get its act together fast enough, there's a very real possibility that all of these Indian patrons that fly to Sri Lanka would go to the UAE instead. So if we don't get our industry up to the standards that it should be to be able to compete with a country like the UAE, then we might fall behind and the industry might not survive, right? And another threat has been, of course, like I said, the inertia of the existing industry players who don't necessarily want to see more competition in the industry because they're happy with the way that things are for themselves, because they've been able to find a way to make profits through the industry as is. If we were to bring in significant regulatory changes to the industry, then it might require them to change how they do things, and that might impact their operations. And of course, there's also a strong public sentiment against gambling, which is one of the reasons that the James Packer project failed when it was brought up in the post 2010 era. Some of this opposition, of course, is religious, because Sri Lanka, being a majority Buddhist country, and the Singala Vada Sutta, gambling is basically discouraged. And of course, the other major religions of Sri Lanka also, in the scripture, if you look at it, gambling is not necessarily endorsed. So that is one of the reasons for the public sentiments against gambling. But also there's the association of things like drug trafficking, prostitution, money laundering, and all of these different other industries with the casino industry. Although there's no direct evidence that these things actually go on in Sri Lankan casinos, this is something that people have basically etched in their brains, that somehow the gaming industry is synonymous with these other things. That has also led to contributed to this public sentiment against gambling. So our report, what it does is makes the moral, economic, fiscal, and equity case for an expanded and well-regulated casino industry of Sri Lanka, from purely from an economic theory point of view. And I will basically walk you through these four elements: the moral, economic, fiscal, and the equity case from here on. So, like I said, a lot of people have strong moral opposition to casinos, right? What they say is true to an extent, even if you look at economic theory, because casinos have traditionally been associated with a lot of negative effects, including negative externalities, which is basically an effect on a third party that doesn't engage in gambling. So if you have pathological gambling prevalent in a country, that could affect families, that could affect society. And also, like I said, there's a lot of associations of other criminal activity like money laundering, drugs, prostitution. Globally, some of these things are well documented. And you also have the personal cost to gamblers. People go bankrupt when they're addicted to gambling. The question is, can a blanket ban on casinos help you get rid of these issues? And what Singapore found out the hard way after they had a blanket ban on casinos for the longest time was that you can't actually eliminate any of these issues with a blanket ban, because it's in human nature to gamble. So human beings are going to engage in gambling whether it's technically legal or not. So what Singapore found out was rather that it's better to allow the industry to operate in a legal environment and then regulate the industry to minimize these negative externalities, as opposed to hope that it all goes away if you put a legal ban on gambling, right? You also have the experience that the United States went through with the prohibition on alcohol in the 1920s, when they tried to ban alcohol, but it only led to the flourishing of informal alcohol industry. And that is similarly what you have found if you look at the experiences of other countries that have tried to basically ban gambling. They've never been able to effectively eliminate gambling. So what you have happen is basically the industry moves from the formal sector to the informal sector, and whatever goes on in the informal sector you can't regulate, right? And you can't tax it either. So then you don't necessarily address the issue but just push it aside. And another reason why gambling needs to be regulated is the consumer rights aspect of it. And I have this example of European roulette, which is basically you have to pick a number from 0 to 35, right? Uh, and the natural odds of you winning is basic 1 over 37. But if the casino knows that you're more likely to pick 7 because it's considered to be the lucky number, and less likely to pick 9 because it's considered to be an unlucky number, then maybe they can manipulate the machine or the wheel to pick 9 more often than it picks 7, right? So there have been instances in the past in various parts of the world where this kind of thing has happened. So the consumer goes in, the patron walks into the casino thinking they have a particular order of winning, and then goes and chooses 7, and doesn't know that the machine has been basically manipulated, right? And also you can bet on colors, you can bet on groups of numbers, odd numbers, even numbers, and stuff like that. And again, if the casino realizes that people are more likely to pick red as opposed to black, or people are more likely to pick even numbers as opposed to odd numbers, because you have to also understand a lot of the people who engage in gambling do it because they believe in luck, they believe in fortune, so they also like to believe in these things, right? So if the casino knows that this is how people think, they're able to manipulate the odds and then increase their house edge. And that is something that regulators also need to look at. Singapore does this, but you don't find this kind of regulation anywhere else. But maybe if the operators are concerned about their reputations among the public, they might actually, there might be some form of self-regulation there, right? To not be involved in this kind of thing. But if the industry is not necessarily interested in its reputation either, if you think of a national industry like Sri Lanka, then you can't guarantee that none of this has been manipulated with if you don't have regulator that actually takes care of these issues, right? So that is also an important aspect of regulation when it comes to the regulation of casinos. um, I have done some case studies on some important countries and how they have tackled the issues uh, of regulation. So Singapore, for instance, has come up with what's called the Gambling Regulatory Authority, which has basically served as a model for a lot of countries because of how successful they have been with it. A part of the reason being that Singapore doesn't necessarily want to expand the industry or generate tax revenues. That is not the main priority of Singapore. The priority of Singapore has always been to minimize the negative externalities on its people, right? So what they have done is basically come up with the gambling regulatory authority that basically runs very stringent background checks before they give the licensing rights to the operators of the two casinos, one in Sentosa, and the other, the Marina Sands Bay. And also there are strict consumer rights regulations that look at the odds and make sure that the consumer rights are protected. There are strong anti-money laundering laws and laws restricting marketing to locals, and also restrictions on pathological gambling. So if you keep losing a lot of money, then the law requires that the casino basically makes you leave and you also have to stipulate a maximum loss limit before you enter the casino, for instance. All of these are done basically to encourage more responsible gambling. There's also for other disincentives to gambling, especially for locals. With an entry fee, if you're a local, you have to pay an entry fee before you walk into a casino. And of course, they also have banned ATMs inside casinos. You can't keep withdrawing money to buy chips. And Macau and Philippines have their own stringent regulations, and because they're not as interested in minimizing negative externalities, they're not as strong as the Singapore framework. But the Singapore framework is basically thought of across the industry as the way to regulate the industry. What you want to do is to minimize negative externalities. I wanted to basically contrast the experience of Singapore with the experience of Cambodia. Similar to Sri Lanka, the government of Cambodia dragged its feet on regulating the industry for the longest time, and the industry did exist and continues to exist in a very quasi-legal framework. What happened was the government basically said you can't have casinos, and then one of the operators who were in business were like, I am in business, so what do you mean it's not legal? And then went to the Supreme Court and won the case against the government. So Naga Corp continues to exist, but there's no legal framework governing its existence. And the industry is popularly rife with political corruption and other criminal activities. And these negative effects are basically unaddressed because politicians don't want to meddle with the industry. They are both scared of what the public would react with if they were to fully endorse and legalize casinos, but also don't want to necessarily get involved with all of the backroom deal making and all of that. And what that has meant for Naga Corp as an operator is that it has never been able to realize the full potential in the Cambodian market as a gaming operator. It, for instance, found it very challenging to be listed in the stock market due to its bad repute when it wanted to go public. And what I wanted to emphasize was that given the similarity with the Sri Lankan case, this could be Sri Lanka's fate if quick action is not taken. So it is very important that we look at the experience of Singapore and look at the experience of Cambodia and realize that even if we're interested in the negative externalities of gambling, the Singapore model will actually help us minimize the negative externalities as opposed to the Cambodia model, where although the government says that gaming is illegal, you still have gaming happening. You have a very well-known operator in the market, but there's nothing that's been done to basically minimize the negative externalities. So our recommendations, like I said, is to basically just have a gaming regulatory authority established, which is entrusted with the power to regulate the industry. It doesn't just have to be casinos. We can have this, if it has a technical capacity to do it, we can also bring the betting and lotteries industries under it. And to introduce a cap and trade system for a limited number of gaming licenses that the government deems optimal based on its determination of how many regulators are optimal, both to minimize negative externalities and also to maintain a particular level of competition that's healthy and also profitable for the industry, right? And also the imposition of restrictions on the patronization of casinos by Sri Lankan nationals through entrance fees, betting limits, and income eligibility limits. Interestingly, Sri Lanka had introduced a casino entry fee, I believe, in 2015, which said that you had to pay $100 to enter a casino if you're a Sri Lankan. But until this year, that law was not in operation, so they never collected the entrance fee. But now it has been reduced to $50, which is 15,000 rupees, and it is being charged when a Sri Lankan walks into a casino. But you can basically buy chips with the receipt that you receive for the entrance fee. You can buy 3 chips of 5,000 rupees each that you can play with. So this is not necessarily a tax if you're anyway going to be gambling once you walk in and you get 3 free chips. So what's the point of having that kind of entrance fee to discourage gambling by locals? So it doesn't serve its purpose. That's again why we need a regulatory body that is actually able to look into the industry, has the capacity and the time to look into the industry and how it operates, to determine which regulations are exactly working and how you make sure that they're effective. Also, to impose strong regulations against problem gambling by both local and foreign patrons through all kinds of limits on their activity at the casinos, and also awareness raising. You have a lot of problem gamblers come to Sri Lanka. What I hear is sometimes they basically bet away all of their life savings, and they have to be basically flown out on the house's dime back to where they came from, right? So how do you deal with these issues? And also, as a responsible think tank, we can't just be concerned about the negative externalities affecting the Sri Lankan population. We have to also think about the world population, especially if they are going to be coming to Sri Lanka to engage in all of this activity, right? So these are also things that we should think about in terms of foreign patrons as well. And also another instance where the government has uh, dropped the ball very unfortunately is with respect to the regulation of online gaming, which has been happening in Sri Lanka for quite some time. But none of the regulations that address the industry right now, including the obtaining of a license. You don't need a license to operate online gaming portals. And all of the casinos in Sri Lanka operate online gaming portals. You also have the betting centers operate online betting portals, and any Sri Lankan can log into any international online casino and basically participate in all of these casino games and betting stuff. Again, Singapore stands out as an example of how to deal with this issue with the Online Gaming Act that they came up with, I believe, in 2022, when they basically brought it under the general gaming regulations, and also specified additional regulations as to who can partake in this. So there's a registration process. You have to go in person to basically obtain uh regist- like a license to be able to partake in online gambling, and all of these things are things that Sri Lanka should take into consideration, particularly given that there was a Sunday Times article, I think last week, that was talking about how prevalent online gaming is among Sri Lanka's youth. So this is a question. This is an issue that has not been looked into, but really needs to be looked into, given the potential for harm to Sri Lanka's youth. And there's, of course, in addition to the need to minimize the negative externalities of gaming, a case to be made for the economic benefits of casinos. What research has found, despite the moral arguments against gaming, is that there are very real, tangible uh, multiplier effects that casinos can bring into an economy, particularly to economies that are based on the tourism industry, like Sri Lanka. So there's an inflow of forex that's associated with casinos. Of course, we don't know in the case of Sri Lanka whether we actually get these monies back to Sri Lanka because the monies can't be traced. But in Las Vegas, in Macau, in Singapore, you see a lot of forex flow in because of the big casino industries that they have. They've also found that the casino industry usually leads to the expansion of tourism, hotel, and F&B industries, which are basically associated industries. When people fly in, these other peripheral industries also see a lot of growth. There's also growth in the construction and retail sectors of the economy as results of the expansion of the casino industry, right? Because you will have a lot of high spending consumers come in, because not everyone can gamble. You need to have particular disposable income to be able to come and gamble, and they also would be high spending uh, consumers when it comes to the retail sector, for instance. And there's also very tangible improvement in employment numbers wherever you've had a new casino industry come up. And what I also hear in the case of Sri Lanka is that people who actually work in these casinos are paid comparably higher than people with similar skill levels in other industries, because of various reasons. For instance, you need to be trained, and not everyone can work as a dealer, so you need to have particular level of competence for that as well. But in other countries, what they've found is the employment effects of the gaming industry are real, and that can be a boost to youth employment specifically. You can also expect to have increased tax revenues if you get the tax system in place. And also people have researched and found that casinos are also linked to enhanced property values in all of these jurisdictions that have allowed uh, casino gaming. But I want to basically point to the benefits of the industry with respect to the tourism, hotel, and F&B industries through the integrated resort model, which is what Sri Lanka country lacks. But what we will get with the City of Dreams project, for instance, which is basically uh, a hotel resort that includes gaming facilities, but also acts as a regular hotel where you have conference halls and restaurants and cafes and all of that, right? And what has been found in the research is that the economic multiplier effect of casinos are greater when the integrated resort model is involved for obvious reasons, right? Because it attracts greater demand for both the hotel and gaming industries. People who come to Sri Lanka for general touristic purposes will then just walk into these casinos that they see at the hotels that they're staying in and gamble a little bit, and that would basically enhance gaming revenues. But also people who come for gaming right now, they just stay at a hotel that they are put at by the casino and not see the rest of Colombo. But if you have the integrated resorts here, right, you can expect people who come to gamble to also basically partake in the other amenities that the hotel offers, and through that you could expect enhanced revenues. And the other case for the integrated resort models is the across the world, an issue with the hotels industry specifically is that the returns are very low, which discourages a lot of investment in the industry. But the gaming industry famously has very high returns, which means you can potentially cross subsidize some of the lower returns in the hotel industry with the high returns in the gaming industry through the integrated resort model. And what that means is that the tourism industry would be more financially sustainable as a result. And of course, the other thing I mentioned is that right now you have a lot of compulsive gamblers flying to Sri Lanka, because that is the consumer pool that the existing operators have been able to tap into, because not everyone just wants to fly to Sri Lanka uh, and gamble at one of Sri Lanka's casinos, right? But if you have the integrated resort model, you can expect to have more casual gamblers who are on holiday here come and play. Another added benefit would be that there will be less concerns about compulsive gambling. Because if you go to, Genting in Malaysia and, gamble for a couple of hours just for the entertainment element of it, then you're less likely to, get addicted to it, as opposed to you going to a particular place for the purpose of gambling, right? So what you're going to find is a lot of people who would not otherwise have engage in gambling as a form of entertainment. So also giving more options to the tourists to have fun, but also at the same time taking care of the compulsive gambling issue in this country. The interesting thing about integrated resort model, because of the kind of investment it requires, is that generally run by internationally non-listed companies, which have very big names. Melco is one of them, but in the international gaming industry, you also have names like Win, Caesars, Venetian, and stuff like that. So all of these operators have a very reliable consumer base that will fly to anywhere in the world that they're located through junket operations and other stuff, and then come and play at these IRs, right? So that is what the potential for Sri Lanka could be if we could encourage more investments in this regard. Um, Something that I was basically, this was given to me by John Keels very graciously with this their data, not mine, but they've gotten it, I believe, from the tourist arrival numbers of those countries. Was the fact that since the opening of the integrated resorts in Singapore, Macau, and Vietnam, they've actually seen a clear increase in the number of tourist arrivals. You of course had the towards 2021, because of the COVID pandemic, the numbers dropped, but before then, there's a clear difference in the tourist arrival numbers before and after the opening of integrated resorts, which makes the case for basically the integrated resort model in Sri Lanka if we want to also expand our tourism sector, which has been a main objective of this government. So in this respect, what we recommend is the incorporation of economic incentives, licensing, and other regulatory frameworks on the gaming industry to encourage the operation of casinos in the form of integrated resorts, as opposed to the kind of standalone casinos that we have in Sri Lanka today, which are shown to have great economic benefits. So if you're going to allow the operation of casinos in this country legally, then we should also allow it in a way that is going to basically maximize the economic benefits to the country. And the IR model is basically a tried and proven way to do this. And also to expand the opportunities in the market for integrated resorts through the enhancements to the labor, business registration, investment, and foreign exchange laws, which have been major discouraging factors for a lot of investors to come and set up operations here. Thirdly, we also make the fiscal case for gambling, which is basically the expansion of government revenues from casinos. If approached right, like I said, casinos can be a crucial generator of government revenues. But right now, this is not what we see in Sri Lanka. But if you look at the examples of Macau and Philippines, for instance, that have basically prioritized revenue generation from casinos. Unfortunately, Singapore, because of its heavy focus on externalities and minimizing externalities, has not necessarily introduced an optimal tax rate for casinos. But Macau and Philippines basically have around 45% of an effective tax rate on the gross gaming revenues of those countries, of the gaming revenues of those countries. Like I said, Cambodia has been a poor example of how to deal with casinos, and you see it in the case of revenue generation also. The government has neither prioritized curbing negative externalities nor revenue generation, and what that has meant is that you have a lot of negative externalities in the country as a result of these casinos, but also they're not even getting any kind of revenue generation out of that. I would put Sri Lanka right next to Cambodia in terms of revenue generation aspect of it as well. Although as of late, Sri Lanka has demonstrated some interest in higher revenue generation through casinos, but there's a long way to go for Sri Lanka. These are some numbers from the Inland Revenue Department on the tax revenues from gaming. Unfortunately, you can't isolate the number for casinos because you only have 4 casinos in Sri Lanka, and there are privacy laws and tax laws associated with it, so we can't publish the numbers on the separate casinos. But this is basically generally what you earn. For instance, in 2022, from both casinos and bookmakers, the government basically earned a total of 5 billion rupees in the form of casinos. But this also excludes the income taxes that they derive from casinos, because this is based on the Betting and Gaming Levy Act. So it doesn't include the income taxes that come from the business income tax, which is at 40% of the profit of the casinos. So one issue with the tax code that we have right now for casinos is that it is quite complicated. You have an annual levy, which is basically 500 million rupees to operate a year as the law stands now. But this has been revised up and down in a very haphazard way over the years, and with no scientific backing as to why those decisions were taken. So that is something that needs to be looked into. Also, the tax on gross gaming revenues in Sri Lanka is 15%. In other countries that have prioritized revenue generation, it goes up to 30, 40, 50%. So there is no explanation as to why it has been set at 15%. And you have the business income tax on top of that on profits at 40%. But given it is very difficult to track the inflows and outflows, the question is, do we actually get the taxes that are due to the government based on this business income tax either, right? And then on top of that, recently the government has introduced a licensing fee, because in 2024 the Gazette was published with a framework to obtain licenses, and what that says is basically to get a 20-year license you have to pay 10 billion rupees and 5 billion rupees if you have an integrated resort with an investment greater than $500 million, with at least $100 million in that investment allocated for the casino on the premises. But the question then is, why do you have an annual levy on top of a licensing fee? What is the scientific justification for that? And also, there is supposed to be a local entrance fee that's $50 that's being charged from this year on. But like I said earlier, you can basically buy chips for that amount. So again, what purpose does this tax serve? On top of that, of course, you have the 14% withholding tax on winnings. Um, because of the complex nature of this tax code on the casino industry, and on top of that, the institutional constraints of the Inland Revenue Department, it's very difficult to make sure that Sri Lanka actually, the government actually receives what it's due from the industry. Um, for instance, the limited scale of the industry, of course, means that probably there isn't a lot of revenue to be generated to begin with compared to other countries that have prioritized casinos. But still, because of haphazard changes to the tax code and the cash-based nature of the industry, and on top of that, the fact that a lot of the transactions happen overseas and we don't know if these are traceable, this leads to concerns and questions as to whether the government receives all of the money it's due from the industry, right? And on top of that, there was a one-time casino industry tax that was imposed in 2015, which was basically 1 billion rupees for each casino. But this tax is also yet to be fully settled by some casinos, as was revealed in one of the COPF meetings, I think several times. It has come to light through reports by journalists as well. So the question is, why has not the government prioritized basically, collecting these taxes? So if we can't even collect this one-time, very specific tax, can it be entrusted to gather all of these revenues based on gross gaming revenues and business incomes, right? So obviously there are institutional constraints that need to be addressed, but to make matters easier for the government, also we recommend that there is some sort of simplification of the tax code on the gaming industry. Just for instance, impose uh, general 40% or whatever tax on the gross gaming revenues and call it that, as opposed to having so many different elements to the tax code. That would make it easier to administer the tax. And also to impose a high and optimal tax on the industry. And there is a justification for imposing a high tax because of the potential for supernormal profits in the industry, given that there is not a lot of competition right now in the industry, and also there's inelastic demand for gambling, which means that even through higher profits, higher tax rates, you should not be able to see too much of a drop in the revenues to the industry. So there is an argument to be made for optimal, very high taxes on the industry. And also the introduction of licensing fees for only online gaming operators. There was a gazette that came out in 2024 that does not mention online casinos at all, although they have been in existence for a decade or so, which is frankly mind-boggling. You also need more stringent frameworks for the better monitoring of cash flows. And I understand there are institutional constraints at the IRD, which of course limits what the government itself can do. But there are some ways in which other countries that have had similar issues in the past have worked around this issue. For instance, the Dominican Republic, until it could put in place a foolproof mechanism to track all of the revenues at the casinos, what they used to do was basically tax the casinos based on capacity. If you have this many tables, then per table at this location. So Santo Domingo being the capital of the country and Punta Cana being the most famous tourist city of the country, Santo Domingo and Punta Cana, the tax per table was higher than in other parts of the country, for instance. So come up with a mechanism that basically taxes the casinos based on their capacity. That would address some of these concerns about not being able to trace the revenues, right? And also you can, because you have literal ATM machines in the casinos, which is where people withdraw their cash from, why don't you trace what kind of transactions go on in these ATM machines and then basically tax based on the withdrawal? So there are many ways in which you can work around this issue of not being able to trace revenues, but it's very important that the government comes up with a foolproof mechanism to actually collect all of the revenues that it's due. And also in the port city bill, basically, if an investment is recognized as one with strategic importance, there is a tax concession given to it. And the worry with all of these special economic zones is that it could actually lead to tax leakages from the industry, given the crucial nature of the industry for revenue generation. What we would like to see is basically an elimination for all potential tax leakages from the industry. Um, One thing with all of these leakages from these special economic zones is, for instance, with a lot of other integrated resorts coming in other parts of the country that are not these special economic zones, then you also have basically competition issues that come up. How is one casino going to be able to compete if it's in mainland Sri Lanka when there's another casino in a special economic zone that basically is tax free, right? So there are all of these competition related issues that come up with all of these tax leakages as well, that can be addressed through an elimination of all potential for such tax leakages. Finally, we wanted to make the case for the equity case for gaming, which is basically replacing regressive lotteries with the progressive uh, casino taxes. What we see happen right now is that the government has basically uh, been reluctant to take the responsibility to take a strategic approach to the gaming industry, and give proper legal status, and through that earn revenues for the government because of the stigmatization associated with the industry. But the government is the operator of two lotteries boards that actually administer lotteries in the country, which are also technically games of chance. So there is technically no difference between you buying a lottery and you gambling at a casino. You're participating in a game of chance. The difference, though, is that the most buyers of lotteries are people that represent the lower economic strata, as opposed to people who engage in casino gaming, who basically go and bet huge amounts of money, who come from a different economic status, right? So the government's over reliance on lotteries for revenue generation actually is very regressive. And one of the basic principles of good taxation is that you make the tax code progressive. So although the National Lotteries Board and the Development Lotteries Board, they contribute to the Consolidated Fund, the President's Fund, and the Mahapola, when you look at the way this operates as a tax on the people, because at the end of the day, lotteries are a tax on the people, because if it's used for revenue generation, then it's a tax. You're taking money from very poor people in the country to give it back to those same poor people. But someone pointed out today that it's not even redistribution in that sense, because you're taking a lot of money from the people, but you're only giving back around 20% of the money that you take from the people, because there are various operating costs associated with the running of lotteries, right? So you have only around 15 to 20% of the money that you collect from lottery sales that go back to the state coffers in the form of contributions to the Consolidated Fund or the President's Fund or the Mahapola Fund, right? So in 2022, you had 40 billion rupees in the form of lottery sales. And if you look at the contributions to the government, that if you look at the 15% number, then that means that the government basically had revenues of 6 billion rupees come from the lottery industry. And the government similarly got 5.2 billion rupees from the very nascent the the casino industry in Sri Lanka, right? So what we are saying is that if we are able to replace the revenue that's generated from the lotteries industry with an expanded and better regulated and well-run casino industry in this country, it will actually improve the tax code of the country for the better. The reasons as to why the operational costs of the lotteries boards are high can be debated, but one of the biggest points that stand out is the general inefficiencies common to all SOEs in Sri Lanka. I've spoken to the lotteries boards. They've been very graceful enough to have meetings with us. What they've said is there are sometimes delayed ministry approvals in the decision-making process, because they both come under the Ministry of Finance, and to make any decision, they have to get approval from the lotteries board, from the Ministry of Finance, right? And also there are procurement guidelines and other different circulars that they have to comply with, that leads to other delays in the decision making process. There's also a bloated workforce, that's limited focus on marketing, and the lack of profit motive. These are theoretically issues associated when the government is involved in the running of businesses. So, what our recommendations are is to prioritize the progressive taxation through replacing the government's focus on the lottery industry as a key revenue generator for the welfare programs of this country, with a focus on revenue generation from the casino industry. And the second point we're making is that it's okay to have lottery industry because people are clearly interested, and for some people, a lot of people, it's a form of entertainment, so it's a good thing. But to restructure the state-operated lottery industry to minimize costs of operations, increase fairness, and optimize contributions to the government. And for instance, if you privatize the lotteries boards, then you can potentially tax the lottery operators, and earn more income than you do right now under the SOE structure of the existing lottery boards, right? So that is also one of our recommendations, to restructure the lottery industry, how the industry is run today, with government participation in the process. So that is it. I believe now we can basically move on to a very high level policy conversation with respect to the points that I've raised. Thank you.